Next year marks the scarcely believable 30th anniversary of the iconic Citroën Saxo. And while that word is so often overused, I do not think it's a step too far for a car as important and as well known and as well loved as these. And this month at Manor Park Classics, we have this pre-facelift Saxo VTS in. The hot hatch that absolutely defined an era and in a way revived the hot hatch market in Great Britain. And in this little video for us today, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Saxo, why it exists in the form it did, and why that makes it quite interesting to start off with. Then, of course, why it became such a sensation in the hot hatch market, just generally in the Super Mini market. And then, of course, we will go for a drive as well. Back in 1996, the Saxo replaced the existing Citroën AX, and at the time, it looked very normal. Certainly, its rise to become the centre of an entire culture was totally accidental, was totally unintentional. But in replacing the Citroën AX, the Saxo did actually look a lot more unusual than you might expect it to be. Because for all intents and purposes, this car is a very standard, very expected European Super Mini. And by 1996, all of its engineering had already been around for a number of years. Yet with that chevron badge on the front, this was slightly unusual. So 20 years before the launch of the Saxo, Citroën was bought by Peugeot. And of course, Citroën became so well known from the 1930s onwards for producing these fantastically well-engineered, always different, always groundbreaking cars, whether they be for the economy market in terms of the 2CV, or they were big luxury cars like the Traction Avant, the DS, the CX, etc. And so Citroëns always looked different to your run-of-the-mill average family cars. And even after Peugeot took over, Citroëns continued to be that little bit different. Indeed, in 1982, the new mid-size Citroën was the BX, and while it had a lot of Peugeot componentry beneath it, it still had fantastic hydropneumatic suspension. It had striking Giugiaro styling, and so for all intents and purposes, it still felt very much like a Citroën. Indeed, in 1986, when they launched the AX, they knew that that would have to be a very simple, bare-bones economy car. But rather than basing it directly on the Peugeot 205, instead the AX majored on being a lightweight. Citroën AXs weighed absolutely nothing. They had a plastic tailgate, for goodness sake, so that they would do incredible fuel economy figures. There was something about every single Citroën car that no matter how it was conceived, no matter where it came from, it did something slightly groundbreaking. That was until 1990 when they launched the Citroën ZX. The ZX was the precursor to the Peugeot 306 that came along 3 years later, and for all intents and purposes was the replacement of the BX we mentioned earlier. And the Citroën ZX may have looked a little bit like a Citroën, but under the skin it was entirely normal. It had passive suspension, it had a normal looking hatchback body, and it was now absolutely full of Peugeot components. The Saxo was really the second Citroën to be born out of this mould, to be something that was entirely expected based on existing PSA hardware, but as a result, for a Citroën, this looked unusual. And so immediately we have a bit of interest here, where to the untrained eye, the Saxo looks like just another European Super Mini, but to our enthusiast eye, sees the changing of the guard at Citroën. The end of those old days of innovation, of constantly doing things that were different just for the sake of being different. So the Saxo potentially could have already gotten off to a bad start, but the folks at PSA knew exactly what they were doing. The Saxo was based on a car that was already 6 years old by this point, its sister, the Peugeot 106, launched in 1990. And the 106 was itself based off the Citroën AX, which had bits underneath it from the Peugeot 205. And so this car had heritage stretching back 13 years by the time it was eventually launched. And so this car was absolutely geared up to take the mainstream, something that Citroën had sometimes been in their economy cars, but had always been to just take the mainstream market, the solid, dependable, expected market, by absolute storm. Up to this point, the Saxo was the most closely badge-engineered car that PSA had ever made. Indeed, if you park a 106 next to a Saxo, it is so obvious that they're the same car. All the hard points are the same. The body shell is very, very close. Not quite the same, but it is very close. And the doors look pretty much identical. Maybe they are identical. And of course, they all share the same engine under the bonnet and have the same suspension, something we'll get to when we go for a drive. So if the Citroën Saxo launched in 1996 and was already based on a car that was 6 years old, and that itself had roots in a car that by that point was already 7 years old, by this point 13 years old, then why did it become such a huge success in Great Britain? Well, while I'm of the view that the 106 is a better looking car, it's more chiseled than the Saxo has a friendlier appearance. It has a slightly more feminine appearance, and in the late 1990s, when a lot of small cars were looking very much the same, they were looking very samey, they were also looking quite dull. Think the Mark IV Ford Fiesta, for example. The Saxo was incredibly stylish, and when you spec'd it up with the alloy wheels, with the 16-valve engine and this fantastically jazzy interior, you get something that was actively fashion conscious, something that this era of motor cars was crying out for desperately, and the Saxo is what filled that niche. Of course, people were very, very happy to buy it because under the skin, nothing was unexpected. Saxos are almost bomb-proof little cars, and while they have their little foibles here and there, what doesn't, let's be honest, everything here was easy to maintain, easy to service, and of course was affordable in the first place. But before we go for our little drive, I want to figure out why it became the centre of that culture. And that's because Citroën realised what was killing the hot hatch in the 1990s. So if we remember back to the 1980s, we have this huge array of hot hatches we can choose from. You could have a Ford Fiesta XR2i, you could have a Vauxhall Nova GSI, you could have an MG Metro Turbo, you could have a Citroën AX GT. And in the slightly larger segment, you could have a Volkswagen Golf GTI, of course. You could have an Escort XR3i, you could have an Astra GTE, you could have an MG Maestro. Hot hatches were just absolutely everywhere. They were the thing in the 1980s. But as the 90s started to roll around, that started to change because car insurance premiums started to go mad. If you remember back to the early 1990s, you'll notice that the Volkswagen Golf became very normal. The GTI did not look like a hot hatch anymore. The Escort XR3 and the Fiesta XR2 both died off. And all the cool red accents and houndstooth seats of an MG Metro or Maestro were now absolutely gone, pushed into the weeds where people just weren't buying hot hatches anymore. We notice this best of all when we look at Citroën and Peugeot, when the 1.9 litre 205 GTI was killed off and nothing really replaced it. Sure, there was a Peugeot 306 S16 and there was a 106 GTI with a smaller 1.6 litre engine, but that same market was not adequately replaced. And Citroën saw this problem and realised that they needed to beat the insurance premiums and get young people into these cars in order to make them the fashion icon they eventually became. Very quickly, advertisements went up in dealers and went on television and the radio, not only offering incredibly competitive finance deals on Saxos, but also a year's free insurance. Approved used Saxos also ended up getting this year's free insurance, and so suddenly it became more financially viable for a young person to buy a brand new car, whether it was a Saxo VTS, VTR, or just a little 1100 Saxo. Whatever it was, it suddenly became viable for a young person to buy new rather than to drive around in some old battered clunker. This was such a big deal because, of course, the Saxo was contemporary, the Saxo was modern, and so everybody wanted to be seen in a car like this, and they suddenly were able to get them. They then became the centre of that kind of max power culture in the late 90s and the early 2000s because they were the cars that young people could have. That's something that I think modern manufacturers could really take note of, not of building a car that is better than anything else, not particularly in producing a car that is better looking or has more features than something else, but a car that people can actually afford, and one as a result that they want. So let's figure out why it was such a great hot hatch by going for a little drive. So the first thing you really notice about the Saxo is that it has a very PSA driving position, which is to say that it's very good, it's very comfortable, but the pedals are almost recessed up into the dashboard slightly. So if you've got big boots on, for example, you find yourself slightly catching the dashboard. The steering wheel is also maybe a little bit low and the gear change slightly far away, but for a small car that realistically was designed in the 1980s, it is a very, very good driving position. And that is what the French became known for in this period, was producing small cars that were more competent than those produced anywhere else. But this being a Saxo VTS, I'm suddenly getting a little bit more noise, and I don't know whether this car has had an exhaust put on it, but this little 1600 TU engine, with 16 valves of course, has a load of punch about it, and it makes a great raughty little noise. It reminds me actually, in a funny way, that I've never noticed with an 8-valve TU. It reminds me quite a bit of a Rover K-Series engine, which is only a good thing as far as I'm concerned, because that is my favourite 4-cylinder engine ever. And it has that high-pitched kind of whine to it, but it also has this bark as well. And so I feel very much at home in this car and just rev match down the gearbox. And the other thing, this gearbox is very, very close ratio. And so I can be bobbing up and down the gears at these very normal road speeds and not be losing any kind of momentum in terms of the engine's revs. So yeah, my immediate impressions is that I like this very, very much. So that 1.6 litre engine might not be as large as an old 205 GTI, which of course had a 1.9 litre engine, but that old XU engine was very, very rough. It was a very coarse engine, and it only had 8 valves. And so while it produced 130 brake horsepower, which was a heck of a lot in the mid-1980s, we're talking a serious amount of brake horsepower. This, a few years later, makes 130. Sorry, I was getting carried away with the car. 130 was the 205. These produce about 120. But we're very, very close. We are certainly on the same page. And a smaller, freer revving engine in a slightly smaller car as well makes it feel a little bit more lively. It makes it feel much more peppy because this engine has a brilliant character to it that a 205 GTI just doesn't. It feels like an old big car engine being put in a little car, whereas this feels like a performance-led small engine in a small car, if you get what I mean. It just feels as though it was meant to be, as though this engine was built for this car, as opposed to an engine from another car just being installed. And I must say as well, I love the feedback I'm getting from the controls. So of course we have power-assisted steering, and so there isn't quite the feedback you'd get in a non-assisted, but as opposed to many earlier power-assisted cars, you get a bit of weight still in this, and you get quite a bit of feedback from the road as well. And I'm just loving rev matching down the box. There's no feel in the throttle pedal whatsoever, but that engine makes itself so well known that it's an absolutely charming little thing. I absolutely love it. And I must admit that I have driven an 1100cc Saxo before. And I've also driven a Peugeot 106 GTI. And this engine feels a lot sweeter than the one that was in the 106 GTI that I drove. And they're the same engine. So realistically, it's a case of this one being in slightly better condition, or at least feeling it. But this car is just giving me a bit more feedback than the 106 did. And it just feels a little bit more alive, therefore. So under the skin, in terms of the chassis, we have McPherson struts at the front and a simple torsion beam at the back. It's all very simple stuff, but it's what the French had been using for years before. I said that this car was based on the 106, which itself was based on the AX, and so by this point they had tuned it to such a brilliant extent. And still, cars with this suspension system, these PSA cars all built off this vague platform, including of course the Citroën Zara, including the Peugeot 306 GTI, slightly larger and slightly smaller, all having this vaguely similar suspension system. They're all praised to the gods in period for just driving brilliantly. And I can absolutely feel that in this particular one here. It doesn't have a sense of outright control about it. Instead, it grapples a little bit and it feels very delicate, very lightweight at the front, which gives it a bit more character. Again, I keep using that word, and it's an ethereal word. It doesn't mean anything unless you give it meaning, but there is something about the way that this car handles that isn't perfectly flat, that isn't totally, that isn't absolutely the most competent thing in the world, but it feels alive and it feels like so much fun. And I absolutely love that. I can't believe that these cars are nearly 30 years old. They were everywhere when I was a little kid, and by the time I was learning to drive, to be fair to them, they were absolutely old cars. But they were the centre of British super mini motoring when I was a child. They were never the best sellers. It was always the Ford Fiesta that was the best seller, purely by virtue of having a blue oval on its nose. But in terms of the people who were buying a small car and wanted to feel good about it, in terms of people who wanted mad, jazzy seat patterns, a nice, bubbly dashboard, wanted a really fiery little engine, and wanted some nice style as well, this is very much what I would have gone for in period as well. And I can absolutely see why it became, so much the centre of that Max Power era, that culture when people were still driving small cars that were actually small and that wanted to feel good about them. But there's absolutely nothing offensive about it. It's just a very pretty, very well formed little car, and in VTS form, it's still a fast car. It's still a really, really fast little car. I wish you could still get cars that felt like this, cars that kind of looked like this. But if you would be interested in driving this car around yourself, you could even daily it. This would be such a good daily. Then please do head over to our website, have a look at the photographs of it, and even come here to our purpose-built facility and have a look for yourself.